Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm a minute late. Give me a second. This is me rushing around all day today, as usual. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to be here. I wish it was live. I mean, live like you in front of me because I love to teach people and I like to teach in person. But speaking into a box is fine as well as long as I know you guys are out there. So a little bit of housekeeping first before we get started. Um, I am Melissa Garcia, for those of you who don't know me, and I am one of the shareholders here at Altitude Community Law, and I'm excited to present Committees Gone Amok today. On your screen, you will see the PowerPoint presentation in the center of your screen. This should take up most of the screen. There should also be a small box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen with the video feed, i.e. The presenter, me. On the left side of the menu, please select question and answer icons and type all your questions there, which will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Hopefully these are the right instructions for this kind of webinar presentation, but I apologize if it's a little bit off, if not. CMCA credits are automatically generated once the webinar hosting site provides an attendance confirmation report and will be sent via email within 48 hours following the webinar. These credits are not transferable, so no bargaining with your credits, no, putting them up for poker games or anything like that. You have to earn your credits. Please email Summer Sims at ssims@altitude.law or call 303-991-2076 if you have any questions about receiving your CMCA certificates. Okay, all done. What are we talking about today? Committees. Okay, another housekeeping item. I always want to make sure that everybody looks at our website, looks at our education page. Make sure you get onto our newsletter and our blogs because we always send you what's upcoming. We do e-blasts for all our educational events. So the next webinar is noon to 1 on September 13th, taught by the fabulous Kate Leeson. And she's one of our foreclosure attorney specialists. And the topic is deeper dive into foreclosures. That ought to be fun. Fun is a 4-letter word when it comes to foreclosures, but and as all with 1137, I'm sure she's going to talk about that and how it's affected foreclosures. But that is again September 13th, noon to 1. And then for those of you in the northern Colorado area and the Greeley area specifically, you are your boards, and anyone is able to go to this. But we do city workshops for various cities, and the next one is in Greeley, and it is on September 13th as well. So it's the same night, and this is from 5:30 to 8. It's on the smorgasbord of legal stuff. So we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different things. And it's going to be taught by myself and the fabulous Amanda Ashley. So we're excited about that. Send your boards to that. Make sure that you get onto our website. And if you just go to the education section, then you'll be able to sign up for that. So we're talking about committees today. And I love committees. I don't know how many of you have boards that have a ton of committees or use them at all, or have never even heard of using a committee and you're just interested in it. But we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of committees that you can form and why you should form them, and the good, the bad, the ugly, why some committees will run amok. Why do you need them? Which I think you do need them for various purposes. How do you create them? What kind of authority do you need to create the committees? How do you make sure that they are a successful part of your community? That's really what we're going to talk about today. And it should be an ongoing discussion, particularly at the beginning of the year. I know we're going to go into election season here, or we're already there maybe. But when you're thinking about, let's say the new board gets elected and you're thinking, well, what are our big projects next year? This is when the committees discussion should come in. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What's really important when it comes to forming committees and using committees is that the committee members themselves know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They have to know what their duties are in addition to their limitations. And the bottom line is they shouldn't be set up to fail, or shouldn't be set up in a manner that makes you fail. makes the manager fail, makes the board members fail. All too often, committees are created where the members the committee members don't really know what their limitations are, and they kind of think they're autonomous when they might not be autonomous. And they really don't have any clue what they're supposed to be doing, or how often they're supposed to be reporting, or what if there's any budget that they're allowed to, what their expectations are, what they should be saying to homeowners, for example. All of these things could lead to clashes between the committee amongst themselves, maybe, and the board, and or the manager, and or the homeowners. I mean, it could lead to a lot of problems. So we're going to talk about how to minimize those clashes and those problems. So let's jump right on in. So what is a committee? If I were teaching at a live class, I would pick one of you to tell me what a committee is. And I would pick one of you that's been around for as long as I have, which is a long time. But since I don't, I'm just going to tell you. So committees, in my mind, are just simply a group of people that help out the board and help out the management company in meeting those never-ending lists of tasks and responsibilities that are foisted upon both the board. That's terrible. I'm already loading my sentences there. That the boards and managers are happily engaged in administering and handling and promoting and enforcing for the good of the association. They're often performed, I mean, some of them are performed to just do one task, or maybe one function, and with the exception of a few that could be very clearly defined in the governing documents, for the most part, committees are really formed by the board within their scope of duties that the board decides within certain parameters, and they're formed to investigate, gather information, help out all the foundational information and everything that the board would typically do on its own or with a manager, help out to get that information all nice and neat and tidy and to the board so that the board can make informed decisions. And so again, that's typically with committees that the board are forming ad hoc committees, or other committees that the board is forming as needed. But sometimes those committees are actually defined in the governing documents, and we'll talk about that. But the main point is you need to look at both the authority of forming those committees, as well as if you are going to form an ad hoc committee, why are you doing it? What do you need the committee members for? How do they help the board? How do they help the management company? So so they're used for various reasons, and we'll give some examples. We'll talk about some specifics. But what are the general benefits? And for those of you who've had committees, I mean, I know that there's the Architectural Review Committee, which we'll go into some of the details about. That's kind of its own island, and they have their own duties and limitations and everything. But for all the other committees, let's say you create a social committee or a landscaping committee. What are the benefits of doing this? Is this just creating another layer of responsibility? Is it just creating more paperwork? Well, if you do it right, it's not supposed to be doing any of that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I thought were the benefits of committees, and you can certainly put in your chat box or put in the questions or whatever what you think committees are great for and what are some of the positives. I think it's really good to bring this up during the election season. After the board is elected and you're trying to seek appropriate members for various committees, you really need to talk about the benefits of it, or they're just going to see this as another way for them to volunteer without any potential benefit and no pay. I mean, the boards don't get paid. Committee members usually don't get paid. So you need to understand what the general benefits are. And here's what I think. So number one, assistance to the board. Obviously, by establishing the HOA committees, the board members can delegate some of those tasks and responsibilities to volunteer homeowners, and maybe not even homeowners. So we'll talk about that too. They can take care of more of the basic tasks, while board members can then focus on bigger HOA duties, such as preparing the financial reports, taking care of the HOA funds, and planning capital improvement projects. With the board and the committees working together, the community is able to function properly. And I would say just the fact that it's a help to the board, which it is almost like a second full-time job for the board, it lessens the burden and it frees the board to be thinking about things from this level versus this level. So some of the little tasks, or just the information gathering. So you have a committee that you want to, like, what did I just mention? I mentioned maybe like a budget committee, and you don't necessarily know if you want to use a particular or move forward with a particular capital improvement project on your budget, because you don't know, do the homeowners want this? Is it really feasible money-wise? What does it entail? All of that stuff. Maybe the committee is putting together those numbers for you and seeking out input from the homeowners and using the polls and all of that. So it helps provide valuable assistance to the board. Drawing upon the skills of volunteers. HOA committees should really, you should really use the skills and particular skills and talents of their volunteers. One of the benefits of the committee is that you are, depending on what it is, what the focus is and the goal, is you can draw upon particular skills and talents of your volunteers and those people who don't necessarily want to be on the board. They want to help because they have, for example, social media. Okay, let's say you have a technological committee or a website committee or a social media committee. Chances are 99% of the board, 75% of the board really does not want to have anything to do with social media or figuring out what the values of social media are, or running it, monitoring it, making sure that the appropriate information is going to be on it or not, figuring out what's the best platform for your particular community. Is it Facebook? Is it Nextdoor? Is it Twitter? Is it, or X? Whatever it is. So you get those, if you draw upon volunteers who have both interest and skills and talents in the particular committee function, then it's better for them. It's beneficial for them because it feeds their soul, or it feeds whatever needs they have. And it makes you, the board and the manager, look like hey, we're collaborating with everyone to bring you the best services to the community in the best interest of the community. Foster community engagement. So I often see when board members get on the board, and they've never been on the board before, or maybe they have, and all of a sudden this invisible wall goes up between the board and the homeowners. It just gets created, and unfortunately you have to work and remember about this and keep this on the front burner and always be consistently breaking down that wall, because the wall is there. It's an invisible wall, and it happens. And all of a sudden it's the board against the homeowners. And even though the board are usually homeowners. So with committees, the board this is one way of breaking down that wall, because the volunteers on the committees are not on the board often. Sometimes there's board members on the committees, but most of them are not. So you're sharing ownership of whatever that project is. You are collaborating. You are seeking out other people's opinions so that you don't just have this invisible wall saying, hey, the board's just doing everything on its own, or the management company they're aligning everything towards their interests only and not us homeowners. That's not true. The more you use committees, the more you show it's not the board, it's not the manager, and it's not just us trying to cram something down you. Guess what? We are asking input. We are seeking feedback. We are getting others involved to have ownership for that particular project. And what's great is if you get a committee that really owns that project and is really involved, then if it is a project that's the basis of the committee, later on when you're trying to sell that project, let's say it's a new for perimeter fence or maybe a new color scheme for the community, now you've got a committee, and it's not just the board, but it's the committee members that can help advocate for you. So again, strengthen numbers, and also showing that, hey, we're sharing this with everyone. It's not just us as board acting in a vacuum. It's everybody we're asking for everyone to pitch in. And so it's all of us together in the same boat. We just happen to be steering it. I don't, do you steer a boat? You steer a bus. So on the same bus, whatever. So finally, provide training for future board members. I always, I think, a lot of homeowners and volunteers, they don't really want to become a board member. It is a tough job, as you know. And maybe there are many who wouldn't come forward unless they're told to, or unless they can see, they're shown that, hey, this is what's really involved. And I think I can be a great part of this. I think I can help out. It's not as scary as I thought. It's not as much work as I thought, particularly if you have committees, because it won't be as much work. So with the committees, you'll be able to see also, they'll be able to see what the board does because they're going to be involved in this. And you'll be able to see which homeowners or other volunteers have the potential to become future board members. So this participation in the committees can help them. I see it serving as sort of training for the future board members so they know what's involved and what you're thinking about, and they're helping along with the task. So those are my benefits, what I think that the committees are good for. And so certainly let me know if there's others. All right, so the other thing is for committees in general, what are they required? So no, they're not required. Not often. Certain ones might be. So the statute, Kiowa, Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, and Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act, neither of them require you to have committees. However, as you probably know, especially many of the managers and board members who've been around for quite some time knows that the documents sometimes require them. So the governing documents, so you need to look at those. Maybe the declaration will often have the Architectural Review Committee or the Design Review Committee is a required committee. I mean, not all of them say this, but it's mentioned, in other words. The governing documents sometimes will mention a particular committee. I wanted to read a sample provision that I see that I think gets glossed over. I see this in a lot of documents, but I don't think that people notice it as much. But I see it in both old documents and new documents, and usually in the declaration, sometimes in the bylaws. But there's authority. There's that long list of authority. Sometimes it's an authority, and sometimes it's a duty. So it'll be this long list of what the board has the authority to do or the board shall do. And underneath that, sometimes you'll see something that says, by resolution, the board either has authority or shall establish permanent and standing committees of directors to perform any of the above functions under delegation. So you have that laundry list of things. And oftentimes there's language in there that says very clearly that the board has authority to designate committees to perform any of those functions. So look for that language if you're wondering, well, where is that language? There's also, I'm going to read some more of it later on when we're talking about specific requirements that the governing documents might have for particular committees. So look to the documents. So what kind of committees can you create? There's the standing committees. And those are the committees that are that a board uses on a continual basis. So oftentimes they're already mentioned in the governing documents, like the Architectural Review Committee. They can be in the governing documents, or they can be established by the board and customized. And we'll discuss those and some of the problems that arise. But some examples would be that, like the Architectural Review Committee, the Budget or Finance Committee, a Landscape Committee, Events Committee, Communications Committee. There's so many different kinds of committees. Social Committee. These are things that you would be using on a regular basis. So every year you're discussing these things. Versus ad hoc committees. Ad hoc committees are formed for typically a limited period of time, and they do address a specific need. So when the work of the ad hoc committee is completed, then the committee is dissolved. Excuse me. And an ad hoc committee could exist for 3 months, could exist for a month, it could exist for 3 years, it could exist, whatever the term is, but it really depends on the goal of that committee, of that ad hoc committee. So an example might be a committee that's formed for the purpose of investigating a proposed new build in the community. So let's say you're thinking about a new perimeter fence or a new swimming pool And let's say you're replacing the parking lot with a swimming pool, or you're replacing the swimming pool with the parking lot, for example, or dare I say it, a new pickleball court. So that is certainly something that seems to be on everybody's mind right now. But the committee would be investigating things like, what are the pros and cons of this proposed project? What are the costs of the project? What's the timing of the project? Which contractors are best for the job? Do people really want it? Should we do a poll? Should we do a survey? You know, what's the best color scheme? You know, all those things, that's information the board needs to make an informed decision. And that's what the committee would often do. I wanted to talk about one of my favorite, let me really quickly talk about executive committee. Sometimes the documents themselves say the board shall or may appoint an executive committee. And the only definition I can find of that is the executive committee is actually a committee made up solely of the board members. So maybe you have 3 of the board members or 4 of the board members out of the 9 board that are put together for a particular function that they are designated to do, but they're just made up of board members. I don't see that too often, but every once in a while the governing documents call for it or, you know, clarify it. But for the ad hoc committee, I want to talk about document amendment committee. This is an example of an ad hoc committee, because if you are rewriting your governing documents, you definitely want to have a committee, if you can get people involved, to help you with this. The reasons, there's so many reasons why. Number one, transparency. As you know, all the legislation these days is really mandating or shoving you towards transparency. A document amendment committee formed for the sole purpose of assisting with rewriting the documents is a great example of how you're being transparent from the very beginning. We are seeking your help. It also helps the board with, for example, if you're not really sure about a particular provision. Let's take leasing, let's take Airbnbs, or maybe some kind of parking issues, and you don't really know what the pulse of the community is. The document amendment committee could certainly be instrumental in sending out surveys saying, hey, we're in the process of assisting the board with working through rewrites of the governing documents. One of these questions that has come up is, should we add an Airbnb provision, a prohibition or whatever? Should we add a parking provision or prohibition? Those are the things that the committee would do. They would help you sort of, test the pulse of the community. And maybe there's a committee member from each part of the neighborhood. So you have, let's say you have 2,000 people in your neighborhood, and you get somebody from each sort of area. So you can get a really good sampling of the entire community. And what's best, again, at the end of that document committee, or the project, when you're actually in the process of trying to sell those new documents, you are trying to get people to approve them. Now you've got this entire committee that has been there from start to finish that will help you articulate it, show you that, no, this is not just a board trying to shove something down your throat. You might have somebody who is a neighborhood naysayer that you've pointed to that committee that could be good, could be bad, but if it's good, they will be your biggest champion of the project because they're the most vocal. They might be very dynamic and influential. So committees for document amendment, I just wanted to bring that up because it's really, really important. Okay, so typically, sorry, this is all over the place, but typically these would show up one by one. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about things that might make committees good or bad. And as you see in this little thing here, we have a committee meeting tomorrow to discuss forming a subcommittee to discuss why we have so many meetings. So don't be late. That's terrible. That is the committee for the purpose of forming a subcommittee for the purpose of saying, why do we have all these committees and why are these committees so terrible? You know, obviously you set it up for success or you set it up for failure. So for example, one of these things here is save time or suck time. I'll give you an example. The design review committee, for example, that is running amok. The board is consistently having to review applications and provide input and et cetera, because the committee has made some bad decisions in the past. We will talk about the Architectural Review Committee and how that is one of the most important committees to be very clear about with respect to duties and scopes and limitations and all of that, because the decisions and impact of an Architectural Review Committee, if it's not functioning properly, will have lasting impact on the association, more so than most of the other committees. So that's an example. Assist, or does the committee assist the board or hinder it? Is the committee coming to the board with too many options? Maybe you form a committee and you say, okay, this is our goal. Our goal is to determine the next color scheme for the community, and then they come to you with 20 options of different color schemes. Not providing enough information for the board to make an informed decision, not coming with recommendations, causing delays. I was actually speaking to a manager the other day, and he was saying that the committee itself was not working because the committee, he had sat in on 5 committee meetings, and it was just, and it could probably have been done in 2, whatever the project was. And it was to such an extent the management company was saying, you know what, we're going to have, even though I've been sitting and trying to help with this committee, we're going to have to start charging you for all these additional meetings because the committee chairperson wasn't steering the committee the right way, wasn't controlling it the right way, wasn't managing the committee. And probably there might not be a committee charter. I don't know, who knows, but whatever the reason is, it's causing delays. Spread the work. What I mean by that, help to spread the work, is committees can assist with looking at options, and this is more about assistance of the board. They can help the board with obtaining bids, getting appropriate materials or designs, talking to contractors, establishing RFPs. They can be really instrumental in helping what can be a very large burden on both the board and the management company. Obviously, you need to be working, the board and the management company need to be working together to ensure that they understand their roles. So if the management company is doing something, then you shouldn't be having a committee do the same thing. You don't want to duplicate roles or step on anybody's toes, but they can be very instrumental and helpful depending on what tasks are delegated to them. Functional or dysfunctional. Let's say when I put that up there, I was thinking about not potentially if you're not appointing the right committee members, which we'll talk about in a second, and they're not following the scope or they're not working well together. And then finally, community involvement. Of course, again, we talked about some owners not wanting to be involved, and the committee actually might open their eyes to whether or not this could be good for them to be board members. You can also, again, turn potentially the neighborhood naysayer into your greatest advocate. Sometimes, not always. Okay, forming a committee. What kind of authority do you need to form a committee? So with the exception of a couple of committees, it's really up to the board, and there's authority from the statute, which we'll talk about in a second. But the Architectural Review Committee almost always is addressed in the declaration, sometimes even in the bylaws, sometimes in the Articles of Incorporation. But when you're looking for authority and requirements and specific parameters for the Architectural Review Committee, sometimes called the Design Review Committee, always look at the declaration and your governing documents to make sure that you know what your scope of authority is or what the board's scope of authority is in appointing that committee. Sometimes, and this is important, I see this a lot actually, so you need to, what I hate to see is something very clear that's in the governing documents and nobody's following it. Because what happens when nobody's following it? It could expose both the board and the association to liability for failure to enforce clear provisions in the governing documents. And one of those provisions is the nominating committee. I see this often in the bylaws. And if it's in there and it says shall, it's mandatory, then you shall appoint a nominating committee. So what I often see, I'm going to read an example. Nomination for election to the board may be made by a nominating committee. Sometimes it says nominations for election shall be made by a nominating committee. Nominations may also be made from the floor. Sometimes the provision is very particular about how nominating committees are appointed and for how long and when they're appointed. So here's a perfect example. The nominating committee, if appointed, shall consist of a chairperson who shall be a member of the board and 2 or more members of the association. The nominating committee shall be appointed by the board 3 months prior to each annual meeting to serve until the close of the next annual meeting. Nominating committee members, if appointed, shall be announced at each annual meeting. And then it goes into like how they make as many nominations and blah, blah, blah. But that's very specific and very particular. And I see it often in the bylaws. And whenever I'm rewriting the bylaws, I say, or doing a document review, I say, you guys have this. Are you doing this? Is this something that you do? And 9 times out of 10, no. So get rid of that crap if you're not doing it, or you expose yourself to liability, or make it discretionary, not mandatory, because there could be a perfect reason why you want to use a nominating committee in a particular election. Okay, so all others are really statutory, and I wanted to point to you a provision. If you haven't read or looked at the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act, that's on our website, same as Kiowa, Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. Both statutes are on our website. If you just get onto our website, www.altitude.law, it's on the homepage, and they're both updated. So the Nonprofit Act, Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act, is the statute that addresses the authority for boards to appoint committees. So even if you don't have that language in your governing documents, and assuming there's nothing in your documents that prohibit the association from forming committees, which I actually don't think I've ever seen, then it says, unless otherwise provided by the bylaws, the board may create committees. So that's really up to you. But you also got to remember that you're working in conjunction with your current documents. So if they do already address either the requirement or the authority to adopt a nominating committee or a budget committee or an architectural review committee, make sure that the board, in clarifying that, is following and being consistent with and not contrary to what's already in the governing documents. So the other thing that's important too, that's not really discussed too much, is the fact that the Nonprofit Act, in that provision there, discusses that board requirements for meetings, action without meetings, which is the email vote, notices, quorums, those kinds of things, voting requirements, also apply to committees too. And we're going to go into that into a little bit more detail because again, this is unless otherwise provided by law, by the bylaws, but also it's unless otherwise provided by law. So when we're looking at all those board requirements for board meetings or notices or actions by email, all of that, there's Kiowa, which supersedes the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act to the extent of any inconsistency. So I'll get back to that later on in the slide. I just wanted to bring it up. You also might want to adopt a resolution describing the goals, particularly for ad hoc committees. So for ad hoc committees, usually there's some larger goal. Maybe boards are developing sort of an end policy about what result the board wants or for whom and what cost, and the results that the association holds itself accountable for producing. It should be specific with whatever the measurable outcome is. For example, our goal is to increase reserves by 10% by the end of the year, or paint 50% of the buildings this year. While the board is doing this, they're deciding who's going to be involved and making sure the ends are going to be met and developing the process and all of that. That's where the committee comes in. And this is a great way to show that the board is adhering to its fiduciary duties to make sure that these goals are administered and obtained, but they use the committee in doing so. So again, I always bring up the document committee because I think that's a great example of where the committee is part of an overall project that the board is trying to do, i.e. rewrite the governing documents. And so how are you successful in rewriting the governing documents? It takes a lot of work. And one piece of that work, which would be, I mean, I've done this for almost 25 years, is having a document amendment committee to share the burden, to collaborate, to speak with the homeowners, to be your advocate when you're selling those documents. And all part of that sort of goal adopting process. I was going to say that I'm going to be sending, what did I have here? So yeah, I after this class, maybe not today, but all the people who have attended today, I'm going to be sending some follow-up materials, some sample goal sheets, which you can use, and other sheets that we'll be talking about throughout this class that you could use in forming committees. So define the best structure for the committee. The only thing I wanted to say here is effective committees need effective chairs. And as with that example that I used earlier about the manager who has been to 5 committee meetings, the chairperson is really the person that is supposed to ease the interaction between the members and creates the agenda, provides over any kind of meetings, and establishes the ground rules and reports, and making sure that that project is moving along so that you meet the deadlines and all of that. It's really important that the chairperson is great at communication and leadership skills and those things that will really has leadership skills and those things that will really make sure that the project is working on a timely basis. And so one of the questions I sometimes pose is maybe if you have a particular board member who is great at this and wants to be on the committee, because I think it's good for a board member to be on the committee. They don't necessarily have to be the chairperson, but if that person has those skills, then maybe that's the right person to appoint for the chairperson. Is a secretary needed? Maybe, maybe not, depending on the type of committee. Sometimes it's needed, but the secretary really is, if you need one, noting everything that's actually been said and agreed on in the meeting. They should also inform the community potentially on any actions the committee is making. Okay, it says connection is currently unstable, so hopefully everything's working out. Okay, next. Appointing committee members. So when I say thoughtfully appointing committee members, we already talked about this in terms of committee members who might have the particular skill set that would be great for that committee, whether it's because of the goal of the committee or the function of the committee, or maybe it's just somebody who wants to try out for the board and wants to be involved. Maybe it's somebody who has great communication skills and just wants to, hone those skills by being on a committee and helping. But thoughtfully appoint them. Do not appoint the person who you're fairly certain is going to cause the committee to fail because of. Don't appoint a bully, okay? And there's all kinds of bullies. We've talked about that. Don't appoint a bully on the committee. So who can be on the committee? Depends on the governing documents. Be very clear, again, if your governing documents state that, for example, architectural review committee members. It might say very clearly, architectural review committee members must be homeowners. And if that's what it says, then you have to pick from homeowners. Maybe you have an old set that was perfect for when the developer was around that says architectural committee members shall be 2 homeowners and 1 architect or 1 engineer. And maybe that made a lot of sense before, but unfortunately the developer potentially kept that language in there and didn't give any wiggle room. I mean, if it has something like that, it no longer makes any sense to have an engineer be part of your architectural review committee, then maybe you, amend that out of the declaration because it doesn't make any sense. How many committee members are allowed? Again, driven by the governing documents, if they do speak to them. If not, then it's up to you as a board or the board to determine that. Maybe you only need 3 people. Maybe you only need 1 person. Sometimes you'll need 5 because it's a huge project. So it's all dependent on the project. How long is a committee member's term? Same answer as before. Depends on the documents. Depends on the length of the project. And I don't know if I have this in here or not, but you can remove the director or the committee members. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to committee charters. Chairperson, who could be the chairperson? Just that can be anyone. unless your documents say otherwise. But something you might not know, the law was changed several years ago to say that any chair of a committee must meet the same qualifications for those who are serving on the board. So that is a statutory requirement. I'm sorry, I don't have the provision in front of me, but if you're really interested, just email me afterwards. But so that means if you have a qualification section, typically in your bylaws, that says in order to be a board member, in order to serve on the board, you have to be an owner, or you have to be current in your dues. You have to be not violating the governing documents. You can't miss more than 3 meetings. If you have that list of qualifications, or maybe just one qualification, the chairperson must also meet those qualifications. And that's statutorily required. Is a charter required? No, it's not required. But if you don't have one, then that could cause a lot of problems because of what we were discussing before, which is committee members not understanding what their role is, what their limitations are, all of that. That really ought to be provided in a committee charter. One of the things I'm going to give to you as a takeaway from this, and it will be emailed to those who are attending the class today, is we have a sample committee charter, and I will send that off to you. But let me go through some of the things. Obviously, you want the name of the committee on there. That's easy. The purpose. All committees serve at the discretion of the board, and it's according to the purposes of the board. What's the scope of the duties and all of that? What is the purpose? What's the goal? What's the function of that committee? Is it to help rewrite the documents? Is it to determine what the new landscaping scheme is going to be in the front of the community? Whatever it is. Committee chair. You can be very particular about this. First of all, again, it has to meet the same qualifications as board members, but you can say, for example, one member of the committee shall be appointed by the chair, by the board, or be elected by a majority vote of the committee. You can determine what that is. The committee chairs themselves can determine the eligibility of any volunteers wishing to serve on the committee, or the board can do that. So you can determine both who that committee chair is, you meaning the board, sorry, and then what that committee chair's role will be in this committee. Membership, qualifications for serving. You can make these mirror those that the committee chairperson has to meet. That's fine. It's all up to you unless the governing documents say otherwise. So if the governing documents prescribe those qualifications, follow the governing documents. If not, then the board has the ability to determine that. Committee members must be owners, for example. Committees shall include at least one board member. Committee members must be in good standing. Each committee will be no fewer than 4, no more than 9. I'm just giving you some examples here. Membership per committee is limited one person per residence. Members who miss 3 committee meetings are off the committee. So that's all up to you or the board. Terms, what I mean by terms is how often they will stay on the committee. You can establish terms if you want to. You don't have to have any caps on terms. They can continue to serve every year if you want to, or you could say only for 2 years and you're off. Then we're going to circulate it, whatever. Oftentimes you can't get enough people to serve, so I'm not a huge fan of putting some kind of cap on terms, but sometimes it's needed. So, and again, look at what the governing documents say. The termination of when I say term, I also mean the term of the committee itself, because again, there's ad hoc committees, not standing ones, but ad hoc ones that they're created for a particular purpose. Once that purpose or that goal is met, they're dissolved. And so that all should kind of come in together in the board adopting the resolution for forming the committee, in the committee charter itself saying this committee is going to terminate by resolution of the board as soon as the goals are met. Meetings. You could prescribe, depending on the project, whether meetings are required or just one meeting, or how often the meetings are required. That's going to depend on the scope of your project and how long you have to get this project done, how quickly you want to do it. And so you can certainly prescribe those. Maybe committees will meet monthly. Maybe you say something like the schedule can be altered from time to time, but must meet at least monthly or must meet at least bi-monthly, whatever it is that's appropriate. The quorum, I didn't put it in there, but if there's if the committee has decision-making roles, so the board decides that you committee will decide this particular thing versus you committee will bring us all the information and then we'll decide something. Maybe you have the quorum in there saying a majority of committee members has to approve whatever that act is that you're delegating to them. And then scope of duties, limitations, have to be very clear about this. And you have to be making sure that you're monitoring this. In the next page, we'll talk about reporting duties and everything, that they're staying within the scope of their duties and they're not exceeding it. They're staying within their limitations and not exceeding it, because if they don't know what that limitation or parameter is, then they're exceeding it, they might actually also be articulating things to homeowners that they shouldn't be articulating because they've either exceeded their scope or they have not reported enough to the board. And so they think they're going down one direction, they're not. Budget, if applicable. If you're giving them money to do anything, that should be addressed in the charter, what the scope and limitations, receipt submissions, whatever it is, that the money piece is very important if they're allowed to spend anything on behalf of the association. Because as you know, decisions about money are scrutinized the most from homeowners. And it makes sense. They're paying dues to the community, they're paying assessments to the association. They want to know that their money is being spent well. All right. So what happens after? Where am I? Here I am. Okay, minutes and records. I don't know if you can see that, but it says, we are a committee of clocks, you idiot. What do you mean you forgot to record the minutes? Yeah. I am accused of not putting enough pictures in my PowerPoint, so I'm putting little jokes in my PowerPoints. So what happens after the committee is appointed? Minutes and records of actions. Really, the committee should be required to report and provide periodic reports to the board. Again, it really depends on the committee itself in terms of whether they need minutes. Maybe it's something that's going to be done really quickly, but if not, and it's an ongoing project that you need deadlines, that you need to establish all that, I'm going to give you a committee meeting report, a sample one that I'll send to you that kind of discusses things like, how often the meeting and what were the minutes of the particular board. I'm actually giving you, or the committee. I have something here about sample minutes, but I can't find it. But I'm giving you a worksheet for developing the committee charter, as well as a committee meeting report that they can provide. So again, you're trying to be transparent. You're trying to move the project along. So that often takes minutes and recording of the actions to be able to monitor that. And the reporting requirements, it really ought to be maybe every board meeting, depending on what the committee project is. Maybe they're attending every single board meeting. Maybe it's every quarter or something. And they show up and they give you their report, just like anybody else that you're asking. If you're asking the attorney to come and report on a particular status for collections, whatever, the committee should be held to the same kind of standard, so the board again can provide direction, timely direction, and provide also oversight for, hey, the committee is doing what it's supposed to be doing on a timely basis. They're not exceeding the scope of their projects. They're not exceeding their parameters or the scope of their duties or their authority. Review all the recommendations. And so if there are recommendations, that's obviously something that the board should review on a timely basis. And maybe as you're reviewing everything and requesting more info if needed, all of this together is really about the board giving ongoing direction, so the committee isn't running amok and going and doing all these things it's not supposed to be doing because the board is not providing that direction. And definitely refer matters back to the committee if you don't have enough information to make timely decisions and informed decisions. I put the business judgment rule up there just as a reminder to all managers that board members, they owe a fiduciary duty to the association to act in good faith, prudently, and in the best interests of the association whenever they're making decisions. And sometimes those decisions rely on committees who are getting the information to them to make that informed decision, to make sure that they're acting prudently. And so that protects the board. If the board relies on a reliable committee, and they don't have to go off and do all that stuff themselves. So make those decisions, make sure you get enough information from your committee. And if you make those decisions based on all the information and investigation provided by the committee, then if the decision is challenged, the courts are going to defer to the board's decision anyway, because you relied on the committee, on that committee that provided you that information. As long as the committee is reliable, and so you can't be relying on a committee that is constantly giving you the wrong information, or there might be something else that doesn't make their information reliable. So we can talk about that offline, about all the potential things that could happen. Review the need for committees and committee members. So again, if the committee is done because the goal is accomplished, you can dissolve that committee. But also committee members. That's really something important when it comes to the Architectural Review Committee, which I'll talk about in a second. But you definitely need to make sure that the Architectural Review Committee members, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and so that they don't get the association into trouble. What happens after? Continued. So some of the things that sometimes come up, I was going through and I was thinking I was doing an FAQ or something, but one of the questions that comes up is, do committee meetings have to be open to the members? So yes, and I think a prudent way of reading the statute. So 7/128/2033A, way before in this program, I talked about how committees and committee meetings are held to the same standards and requirements as board meetings and board members. And this particular statute of the Nonprofit Act goes into that in detail. They talk about, so one of the things says, this is actually, there's also the provision in Kiowa. It's and I didn't put it up there, I'm sorry, but the provision in Kiowa, for example, says all regular and special meetings. I'm sorry, this is actually the Nonprofit Act. All regular and special meetings of the Residential Nonprofit Corporations Board or executive committees or any committee of the board must be open to attendance by members. So that's stated in the Nonprofit Act. It might actually also be stated in the Kiowa, but I'm sorry, I didn't look up Kiowa in that section. But it's an interesting section. You need to look at it because it goes into detail of all these other things that the committees are held to. Now, again, though, as I said before, you need to read that in conjunction with Kiowa, as well as with any kind of limitations in your governing documents. So, for example, are committee records and emails subject to review? Although the Nonprofit Act says yes on all accounts, Kiowa says in 33.3-317 that here are the sole list of records that are available for purposes, or that should be retained for purposes of inspection and retention. So you need to look at the request under Kiowa first. So when it comes to, for example, minutes, are minutes of the committee open? It says in Kiowa, in 1C, minutes of all meetings of its unit owners and executive board, a record of all so it's minutes of unit owners and the executive board. It doesn't really talk about minutes of the committee meetings there, but it does talk about it in the Nonprofit Act. So there's nothing that prohibits you from allowing those to be seen, but it's not called out. But Kiowa does say a record of all actions taken by any committee of the board. What is the committee of the board? Is that the Architectural Review Committee? Is it any committee appointed by the board? It doesn't really say, but to be transparent, you want to err on the side of allowing people to see the record of the action. However, again, Kiowa says with respect to Architectural Review Committee actions that homeowners are entitled to see the committee actions to approve or deny any requests of the Design or Architectural Review Committee. So it's limited to the approval or denial of the actions. So when we're talking about all these things, I mean, I'm just giving you examples of how Kiowa says, here's the sole list of records that are open for inspection. But the Nonprofit Act is much more open about what you're supposed to allow homeowners to see. So you can take a very transparent look at that and say, you know what, Nonprofit Act says this, so I'm going to allow the committee minutes to be seen, versus Kiowa that doesn't talk about committee minutes. It only talks about board and executive and unit owner meetings. The other thing is, let me see, was there another one? Oh, actions without emails. That can be certainly discussed. The emails that are leading directly to an action taken by the board, those have to be open for inspection of records. And hopefully everybody knows that. If the board is taking action by email and all emails leading to that action by the board are open for inspection, the statute, Kiowa, doesn't say committee member emails leading to committee decisions outside of a meeting. So we have a gap there. So you can certainly say the list of records here in Kiowa is just the board member emails leading to board decisions and not the committee member emails leading to committee decisions. But it's kind of tricky. And so what I would do is, if you are wondering about a specific committee action or records or anything, and whether or not you should or can or shouldn't be disclosing that, or you should be keeping whatever these records, you should talk to your attorney, because we will look at your bylaws, we will look at the specific record you're talking about, and we will also look at what the statute says and what your authority versus your limitations are. And depending on what the board wants to do, how you discuss it under either option. So that's enough for that. Okay, finally, the last couple things the last thing I wanted to talk about is the Architectural Review Committee. And that's because, again, as I said in the beginning of the class, if the Architectural Review Committee is not working appropriately, then that could have lasting impact, negative impact on the association. So for the Architectural Review Committee, also the Design Review Committee, it's called, look for the authority in the declaration, because that's usually where it is. And that will say things like who can be on the committee, how many members, for how long, what is the role of the committee. I mean, hopefully it provides more information than less, but sometimes it's kind of vague. But that's where you find the specifics of the committee, as well as what their role is. Are they only reviewing structures and nothing else? Are they reviewing any modifications to the home? Are they only reviewing for painting? I mean, they're all over the place. The declaration, the provisions on what the Architectural Review Committee is supposed to review for. Don't just assume because you have 90% of your communities that have a provision that say Architectural Review Committees are supposed to review all modifications to the exterior of the residence. Don't assume that that also applies to this one over here, which says the Architectural Review Committee shall review any modifications to landscaping. And that's it. If that's what it says, that's the only thing that the Architectural Review Committee has authority to review. And the homeowners can do whatever they want on the rest of it. So just be very careful. Criteria too, be very careful. The Architectural Review Committee is supposed to review according to certain standards. What is that criteria? If it says that they can review as to, you know, the general sort of, is it aesthetically pleasing? Does it, you know, harmonize? Then that's great, because you have more of a sort of wiggle room to justify and to allow them to have more flexibility, versus can they review for view only? Can they reject based on view? If not, then they should not be rejecting based on view, just for view, for example. So it's very particular in each document. Time frames, so important. If there's a time frame saying that the Architectural Review Committee must submit their decision or submit their information to the board to make a decision within 30 days of receiving a complete application or submission, then you better meet that 30 days, because oftentimes the provision will say, or it's default approved. And then you're kind of SOL. And so that's a problem, obviously. Other problems, they're not reviewing per criteria, or they're saying something like, no one else has ever approved this, so I guess we can't approve it. Why? If it's harmonious, if you're reviewing towards a criteria, it might be something that they can approve. Not reviewing within the time frame, not knowing the law. So the law says you can't prohibit xeriscaping, and there's the whole vegetable garden thing. Not knowing that and then prohibiting xeriscaping, Could be a problem. Causing these unreasonable expectations because they are approving things that are contrary to the documents, or you know, I mean, whatever other things that they might be saying that would cause homeowners to think, hey, sheds are allowed because they approved one when sheds are not allowed. Now all the homeowners think sheds are allowed. So that's a problem. Make sure, all I want to say is make sure that you watch the Architectural Review Committee more than the rest of the committees. It's the most important one, which could have long-lasting problems. And I'm done. Okay, questions. So let's see. Latest messages. Let's start from the very top here. Good afternoon. How would you handle committee? And thank you for those of you who stayed and who will stay through these questions. How would you handle committee that can't agree on a big renovation project budget or detail, and the committee keeps growing in size due to the same? That is really up to the board. You need to, if your board is not appointing a committee that will, first of all, hopefully there's a charter. And if there's no charter or something specifying the timeframes, the goals, the meeting requirements, the reporting requirements, and they are continuously either not meeting those or not coming to a decision or providing inaccurate or missing information, then you got to get rid of the committee. You got to appoint the right people to be on the committee, and the board has to do that. So you have to, if the board's not doing that, then the management company should really step in and go, hey, like the manager I was just talking about earlier, hey, you know, this isn't working. And now homeowners are upset. You've been talking about this great project since January. It's now September, and we have not even gotten through blah. So it's really, the buck stops at the board. What does ad hoc stand for? It just means, you know, as there, I don't know what that ad hoc, maybe that's some kind of Latin term, I don't know, but it just means as needed. So like the document amendment committee, as needed, versus standing, which means you're going to use these committees throughout the year, every single year. They're continual, ongoing committees. Hi, Joel. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Joel. I have a committee that states in the bylaws that any committee they appoint shall have 2 directors or on any committee. Would they be able to have a committee without 2 directors? No, because it says shall. And last I searched, last I read that interpretation, shall means shall. Now, bylaws can often be revised by the board. So if something is not working and you don't think it's working for your community, check with your attorney and check the bylaws amendment requirements, and you might be able to revise those bylaws without homeowner approval, depending on the bylaws, to make for a more flexible application or requirement for committees. Are committee members afforded any liability protection? Oh, what a great question. Why did I put that in there? I was just seeing if anybody would bring up liability. No, I completely forgot to bring that in there. Thank you, Eric, for bringing that up. Are committee members afforded any liability protections, as HOA board members typically are? Or is this entirely a function of whether this is included in the HOA's governing documents? So committee members, well, unfortunately, the statute that talks about limited liability of the personal liability of the board discusses directors, and officers. But there's also another section that talks about indemnifications, where the association shall indemnify, if you put shall in your bylaws, or may indemnify those who are acting on behalf of the association voluntarily. So if your bylaws don't have this, we strongly recommend you put that indemnification in there. But even if it's not in there, how it works is your D&O policy, your directors and officers policy, absolutely should be as broad as possible and not just cover directors, which I've seen some policies say this. It should cover directors, officers, volunteers, committee members, anyone who's acting on behalf of the association. It should be that broad because, yes, they deserve protection as well, particularly the Architectural Review Committee, which could be subject to more claims for lawsuits than maybe even the board because somebody's upset that they turned down their fence or whatever. So, yes, it's not driven by the governing documents except for the language that might say that you shall defend all of the volunteers, but it should be in there. So if it's not in there, you should put it in there and you should amend the bylaws. If it's not in there, you can still have and you don't want to amend the bylaws, you can still have the D&O policy that covers it, and you can have a board resolution that says, you know, one of the things that we are going to do is make sure that we have indemnification and D&O policies for all future and past volunteers of the association. HOA board seems to automatically approve any recommendation made by committee, whether it is in the best interest or not. What's board's responsibility in these cases? That is a great question. And I don't know if I said that earlier. I think it was on a slide, but never, ever, ever rubber stamp a committee's recommendation, you know, or whatever. The board, the buck stops with the board. The board is only supposed to be delegating certain maybe tasks or lists and requiring them to provide that information so they can make an informed decision. But that informed decision means they need to be reviewing that information. They need to be ensuring that this is still within the interests, the best interests of the association. They need to be looking at it in terms of all the other circumstances and information the board already has for whatever that project is. The committee's recommendations is only one piece of it, and the board absolutely should not be rubber stamping that. You know, I mean, I know that it could get really easy, particularly if you have a committee that's been reliable in the past. Always review thoroughly and show that as a board you're adhering to your fiduciary duty to act prudently and informed when making your decisions. You'll be protected from liability if you show that. Do committees need to keep minutes of the meetings? You know, not necessarily. There's nothing that the governing documents say that have to be kept. The Nonprofit Act says yes, unless the bylaws provide otherwise. Kiowa says you don't necessarily have to keep any minutes or have those records open for inspection. So it's kind of a, you know, who knows? But the Nonprofit Act says you should keep minutes. So to the extent that the project for the committee, it requires minutes because it's an ongoing thing. So you need to, and to the extent that the committee has the scope of their responsibilities include actions, which then lead to minutes. So if it all makes sense to have minutes, I would have minutes. Okay, let's keep it at that. Should Zoom recordings of committee board meetings be available to owners? I would say no. You're saying the recording. So not the meetings themselves, because if you're having a meeting of the board via Zoom, homeowners are entitled to attend that Zoom meeting. So if they want to attend, you let them attend, unless you're going into executive session. But if you have a recording of that meeting, then what I would say is you can use that recording in order to prepare minutes. And then once you're done, get rid of the recording. And then the minutes themselves can be circulated to the homeowners. But let's say there's a particular piece of that recording that makes sense to keep and be available for the homeowners. Then I think it's okay, maybe a part of it. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a Zoom annual meeting and you have a contested election and it doesn't become contested until the election itself. So you as a community, you can't have a secret ballot election during the Zoom meeting, because let's say you don't have the platform or the program necessary to do that, to preserve the secrecy while showing that everybody voted who was attending and not how they voted. Let's say you don't have all that information. So one example would be, okay, it's contested. We can't have an election now via secret ballot. We're going to have it later. But we want the candidates to provide their statements of why they should be on the board. I would say go ahead and record that. Record that so that later on, if you decide to have a written ballot vote, secret ballot, written ballot vote, then you could link them to them and say, since we just have this written statement of candidacy, if you want to know more about that candidate, here's a link to the recording that we recorded during the annual meeting. So that's an example of when maybe it makes sense to allow recordings to be seen. Should Zoom recording, do we have to send an invite for committee meetings to all owners every time there's a meeting before the meeting? or would announcing that there's a committee in the newsletter and asking owners to reach out if they are interested in attending their meetings be enough? Yeah, there's nothing right now that says you have to give notice of any board meeting or committee meeting. Okay, there's nothing under Colorado law, either the Nonprofit Act or Kiowa. To be transparent, which a lot of associations are starting to get used to because there might be something coming down the pipeline, who knows when. You could certainly, and a lot of boards already do that, even though they're not required to statutorily. However, there is a section of the Nonprofit Act that says that every year the association is supposed to designate a method or a location of where board meeting and committee agenda meeting, our board meeting and committee meeting agendas are supposed to be available. A lot of boards don't know about that. It's in the Nonprofit Act. You're required to follow it. So, for example, in your annual disclosure, you would say agendas to the extent that they are available and ready for a board meeting or created or whatever. If we post them, they will be here. And then maybe it's on the website or you contact the management company, whatever. So even though there's nothing that says you have to send notice, there is something in the Nonprofit Act that says you shall disclose on an annual basis where those committee agenda or board meeting agendas shall be made available to the homeowners. So keep that in mind. What is the Nonprofit Act section for open records again? It's on the slide earlier on. So you should have the slides and it's written in there. And I don't remember what slide it is, but the actual number is written where I talk about open records, and but the statute you should be looking at that is again on the slide is the Kiowa statute, not the Nonprofit Act, because to the extent that those two are inconsistent, Kiowa supersedes. So look at the Kiowa section, which I know off the top of my head is 38-33.3-317, and that is on a slide. And I hate that I know that off the top of my head because that's how much I consult that. Are texts, either between the board or a committee, that lead to a decision outside of a meeting also part of the permanent record of the HOA and should be stored as part of the action without a meeting record? Great question. So the statute, and again, that this is Kiowa, and it's looking Kiowa 3-317, talks about records and written, I don't have it with me. Let me see if I do. Written communications that directly lead to an action taken by the board without a meeting or, without a meeting. So written communications, I would say that includes texts. So if you're texting, and I would also tell the board that they need to keep to one method of communication. You don't want text, email, whatever. You want email. If you're going to communicate electronically, then email is the way to do it. If not, you're opening up a can of worms. You are exposing yourself to liability if you're not keeping those texts. There's so many things. Definitely don't want Snapchat or whatever the heck other stuff is out there. You want to have one method of communication, and maybe that's what your communications committee should do. Okay, thank you. I think that is it. No, there's more. Okay. If so, how do we capture those texts? That's a great question. I know for texts, you can probably print them out as records, but again, or make everyone print those texts out. Maybe I know that my text, there's a little thing where you can press it and it will send an email of that text to your email. So maybe that's how you do it. But again, I would recommend stop texting. Do committees assume the same responsibilities and liabilities of the board? We talked a little bit about that already. The Nonprofit Act does mirror a lot of committee responsibilities in terms of actions like meeting requirements, notice requirements, agenda availability, quorum, and all that. But it specifically defers to the bylaws, and it also is specifically subject to Kiowa to the extent of any inconsistency Kiowa is going to control. So when we're talking about the procedural, yes, there's committee liabilities and requirements, but with respect to what they're supposed to be doing, that's completely driven by either the board in establishing the committee or the governing documents if they're already established. Thank you. Of course. I have to leave. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Oops, I shall correct them. Okay. Okay, Joel. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, great. Oh, do you recommend any training materials for committees? I'm going to be sending you some materials that you can have, but a great thing that boards can do, I've done this, I've done a lot of training for boards, for either onboarding new board members, or if they specifically want to talk about committees, you can have a class just on onboarding new committee members, and we can go through the goals for the committee, the worksheets for the charters, the committee reports, the minutes, all of that. Certainly you can have your attorney do that, or if the management company is skilled in that, the management company can offer that as well, but I would be happy to. Thanks so much. I am done. It is 1:16. I hope to see you again. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.